Something is happening right now that most people are not talking about, and the numbers tell a story that should make every American stop and think. The United States military, the most powerful war machine ever assembled in human history, is quietly running low on the very weapons it needs to fight. Defense officials inside U.S. Central Command have warned that the high expenditure of Standard Missile-3 and Tomahawk missiles risks what they're calling a Winchester scenario, complete ammunition depletion. And here's where it gets deeper. A January 2026 Heritage Foundation report warns that high-end interceptors, SM-3, SM-6, Patriot PAC-3, and THAAD, would likely be exhausted within days of sustained combat, with some systems depleted after just 2 to 3 major salvos. Meanwhile, Russia and China have increasingly acted as Iran's strategic backbone, providing high-tech assets ranging from orbital surveillance to advanced missile guidance systems, effectively turning Iran into a testing ground for a much larger confrontation. This munitions drain may force the US to divert stocks from the Pacific, potentially compromising military readiness against China, which is precisely the point. Because while America burns through its arsenal in the Middle East, Beijing is watching every missile fired, every interceptor spent, every gap in the Pacific exposed. China purchases roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, moving a substantial portion through the Strait of Hormuz, the same strait now teetering on the edge of closure. This is not a regional conflict, this is a strategic calculation playing out in real time, with consequences that stretch far beyond Iran. Now, let's go back to the very beginning of this story, because to understand what's happening right now, you have to understand how we got here, and why the sequence of events matters more than any single headline you've been reading this week. This conflict didn't begin on February 28, 2026. The seeds were planted earlier, with a 12-day war in June 2025 between the United States, Israel, and Iran, during which American forces struck Iranian nuclear facilities. That war was supposed to be a decisive moment, a surgical operation to eliminate the nuclear threat, reset the regional balance, and send a message that Washington was serious. The Defense Intelligence Agency concluded that Iran's nuclear program had been set back by 2 years following those strikes. 2 years, not eliminated, set back. And anyone who has studied the history of military campaigns in the Middle East could have told you that setback is not the same as resolved. So the problem didn't go away. It incubated, and now here we are again. Only this time the conflict is much wider, much more dangerous, and it's already exposing vulnerabilities inside the American military machine that the Pentagon would prefer you didn't think too hard about. The conflict, dubbed Operation Epic Fury by US Central Command, began on February 28, 2026, with a massive joint US-Israeli air campaign targeting hundreds of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sites across Iran, and in the early hours it looked like another demonstration of American air dominance. Precision strikes, advanced aircraft, overwhelming firepower. That is the story that the administration wanted you to absorb, but there is another story running in parallel, one that doesn't make for good headlines, but matters enormously to the long-term trajectory of American power. The United States military was rapidly burning through its stocks of precision weapons less than a week into the massive campaign of airstrikes against Iran, while also expending sophisticated air defense missiles at a rate that was raising serious alarm bells inside the Pentagon. Think about what that means for a moment. The United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. It has the most technologically advanced armed forces in human history, and within days, not weeks, not months, of launching a major air campaign, it was already facing questions about whether it had enough missiles to sustain the fight. The hard reality is that when you compare today's procurement budget to something like the Reagan administration, the US spends significantly less on the actual weapons themselves, because a large portion of the defense budget goes toward the welfare systems and benefits for service members and women. The money is there, but the weapons aren't being manufactured fast enough. That is the structural problem at the heart of this crisis, and it didn't happen overnight. During the 12-day war in June 2025, the US blew through about a quarter of its supply of high-end THAAD missile interceptors, thwarting attacks at a rate that vastly outpaced production. A quarter of the entire US THAAD stockpile, gone in less than 2 weeks. And then in the current conflict, the burning continued. After the 12-day war, US officials reported that they had to fire more than 150 of these missiles to intercept incoming Iranian missiles, and this is now compounding into the current crisis where analysts warn the high interception rates cannot continue indefinitely. The June 2025 war exposed what analysts are calling a stark cost exchange dilemma. Where the US is using million-dollar interceptors to take down cheap Iranian drones, Iran doesn't need to match America missile for missile. It just needs to keep firing enough cheap munitions to force America to expend its most sophisticated and hardest to replace interceptors. That is a calculated strategy, and it is working. Now here's where the China question enters the picture. And this is the part of the story that most mainstream coverage has either glossed over or completely missed. China values its relationship with Iran for three primary reasons. Iranian exports of oil and gas support China's energy security. Iran's adversarial relationship with the United States diverts American attention and resources that otherwise could be trained on countering China. And Iran serves as an entry point for China to assert greater influence in Southwest Asia. Read that second point again carefully. Iran's adversarial relationship with the United States diverts American attention and resources that otherwise could be trained on countering China. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is Brookings Institution analysis. That is the considered assessment of serious foreign policy scholars. Beijing benefits directly from American entanglement in the Middle East, and it has for years. Russia and China have progressively supported Iran as its eyes by supplying high-tech capabilities, from satellite surveillance to sophisticated missile guidance systems, thus helping Iran avoid operating in isolation. So when Iranian missiles find their targets with uncomfortable precision, when they hit US bases in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, you have to ask yourself who helped Iran develop those targeting systems. The answer is uncomfortable. And it points directly to Beijing. Chinese firms have supplied chemicals used in Iran's missile program and helped build out its domestic surveillance infrastructure. Beijing, of course, maintains that all of this trade complies with international law. But the practical effect, the boots on the ground, missiles in the air reality, is that China has been arming and equipping a country that is now in direct military conflict with the United States. China is Iran's most important economic partner, buying roughly 90% of its oil exports and providing a financial lifeline to the heavily sanctioned regime. When you buy 90% of a country's oil, you are keeping that country's economy alive, you are funding its military, you are paying for the missiles being fired at American bases right now. This is the direct line that connects Beijing's oil purchases to American soldiers ducking for cover in Qatar. It is not a complicated chain of logic, it is simple arithmetic. And yet somehow, in most of the coverage of this conflict, China appears as a peripheral character, a bystander offering rhetorical condemnations while carefully positioning itself for whatever comes next. China has always avoided backing Iran militarily. Beijing criticized the US and Israel's strikes on Iran during the 12-day war in 2025 but did not provide material support to Tehran. This is presented as evidence of Chinese neutrality or restraint. But step back and think about it differently. China doesn't need to fire a single missile. It doesn't need to deploy a single soldier. It has already done its work. Years of investment, weapons technology transfer, missile chemical precursors, surveillance systems, and most importantly, the purchase of Iranian oil that kept Tehran solvent through years of crushing American sanctions. China sees Iran as a long game, which the US's maximum pressure campaign may inadvertently help it win. That is the Chatham House assessment. China is playing a long game, and right now, from Beijing's perspective, that game is going very well. This munitions drain may force the US to divert stocks from the Pacific, potentially compromising military readiness against China to sustain ongoing Mediterranean and Persian Gulf operations against Iran. This is the strategic core of the entire situation. Every THAAD interceptor fired in the skies over Israel or Qatar is one fewer interceptor available to defend Taiwan. Every Tomahawk launched at Iranian nuclear facilities is one fewer Tomahawk available for a potential Pacific contingency. The United States military is a finite instrument, and it is being consumed in the Middle East, while the real long-term strategic challenge, the one that American military planners have been wargaming for a decade, sits quietly in the Pacific, watching and learning. A study released in January by the Heritage Foundation found that the initial stock of US munitions would run out within 25 days of a high-intensity conflict with China, with US forces almost certainly forced to enter the main phase of combat around day 30 in a logistically degraded state, ultimately leading to systemic operational failure as platform losses, fuel bottlenecks, and munitions demand converge. 25 days, that is the American magazine depth against China, and that was before the current conflict began depleting stockpiles further. Every week, this war with Iran continues, that 25-day window shrinks, and Beijing knows the exact arithmetic. The 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis began on February 28th, following the joint military strikes by the United States and Israel on Iran, which included the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In response, Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks, while its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the strait, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic, with tanker traffic dropping approximately 70% and over 150 ships anchoring outside the strait to avoid risk. 150 ships, stranded, waiting. The global oil market didn't just hiccup, it seized. Analysts warned this could present a scenario 3 times the severity of the Arab oil embargo and Iranian revolution in the 1970s, potentially driving oil prices into the triple digits while LNG prices retest the record highs of 2022. And here is the geopolitical irony that should stop every American in their tracks. The majority of the crude oil shipped through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea accounting for nearly 70% of shipments. The United States, which launched this war, is not the primary consumer of Persian Gulf oil. America has been energy independent for years, but the Asian economies that depend on this oil, particularly China, are now scrambling to replace supplies. And who benefits when Middle East oil is disrupted and Asian nations need an alternative? Russia. The conflict is materially improving Russia's competitive position in crude oil markets, with both India and China facing strong incentives to deepen reliance on Russian supply if the disruption extends beyond a few weeks. So you have a situation where an American military campaign is simultaneously depleting U.S. weapons stockpiles, straining U.S. alliances across the Gulf, closing the world's most critical energy choke point, and driving China and India into deeper energy dependence on Russia. This is what a multidimensional strategic trap looks like when it is sprung, and the question of whether Beijing designed this trap or simply recognized an opportunity and positioned itself to benefit may be less important than the simple reality that America is now inside it. Many analysts believe the US-led strikes on Iran are part of a White House strategy to contain China by targeting its energy supplies. That framing, America hitting Iran to starve China of oil, sounds aggressive and forward-thinking, and there is logic to it. If China can no longer buy Iranian oil at deep discounts, its energy costs rise, its economic growth slows, its military modernization becomes more expensive. But that logic assumes the war ends quickly and cleanly, it assumes the strait reopens, it assumes the missiles don't keep flying, and right now none of those assumptions are holding. Neither Israel nor the United States have sufficient munitions, either offensive or defensive, for a war that really lasts weeks into months. That is the assessment of Seth Jones, one of the most respected defense analysts in Washington. Not conspiracy theory, not alarmism. That is the sober, professional judgment of someone who has spent his career studying these questions. The effort to arrest the overall decline in munitions and rebuild stocks faster than they're being expended in global operations will take 1 to 3 years. 1 to 3 years. In a conflict that is burning through interceptors in days, the math does not work. The production lines cannot catch up. And the window of American military superiority, the window that has kept the peace in the Pacific, that has deterred Chinese adventurism toward Taiwan, that has underwritten the entire global order since 1945, is narrowing with every salvo fired in the Persian Gulf. Beijing will be unsentimental about events inside Iran and about the fate of Iran's current regime. For China, its interests in Iran will be focused on protecting stability, ensuring continuing access to Iranian oil exports, and seeking to prevent the emergence of a pro-American regime in Tehran. That last point is critical. China's nightmare scenario is not an Iranian government that collapses, it is an Iranian government that is replaced by one aligned with Washington. Beijing has already begun engaging with Iran's Interim Leadership Council to ensure the continuation of existing agreements and is expected to remain Tehran's most prominent economic and political partner, viewing Iranian stability as vital to its regional projects and energy security. While American bombs are still falling, Chinese diplomats are already working the phones, securing their position in whatever Iran emerges on the other side of this conflict. That is the difference between a country playing checkers and a country playing chess. America is winning the immediate military engagement. Its aircraft are flying. Its missiles are hitting their targets. The Iranian supreme leader is dead. By every tactical measure, the United States appears to be prevailing. But at the strategic level, in the currency of missile stockpiles, economic positioning, alliance credibility, and long-term Pacific readiness, the ledger looks far more complicated. Bombing Iran is not going to do regime change. Air power can degrade capability, but cannot guarantee a stable political outcome. Those are not the words of a critic or a skeptic. Those are the words of a retired US military commander, acknowledging what history teaches over and over again, that military superiority in the air does not automatically translate into political resolution on the ground. The upcoming US-China summit, scheduled for March 31st through April 2nd, 2026, is a critical test of bilateral relations amid a complex strategic rivalry, with Washington expected to request Chinese support in curbing nuclear ambitions and reducing regional tensions. So even as this war rages, the two great powers are still talking, still preparing to sit across a table from each other, still navigating the line between competition and catastrophe, and Beijing, characteristically, is using that forthcoming summit as a reason to appear restrained, to present itself as a voice of stability, to accumulate diplomatic credibility, while its proxy does the work it doesn't need to do directly. China is likely to use US military intervention in Iran to reinforce its messaging, particularly to countries in the global south, that Washington acts as a hegemonic power, while Beijing presents itself as a champion of non-interference. This is the information war running beneath the shooting war, and it is a war that America has historically been slow to recognize and slower still to fight effectively. The bombs are visible, the missiles are trackable, but the slow, patient accumulation of global perception, the quiet repositioning of China as the responsible stakeholder and America as the destabilizing force, that happens in communiques and diplomatic statements and carefully worded foreign ministry press releases. It happens while 150 ships sit stranded outside the Strait of Hormuz. It happens while American interceptor stockpiles drain and production lines struggle to catch up. It happens while the clock ticks toward whatever comes next. In the Pacific, in the Taiwan Strait, in the corridors of power, in capitals that are watching this war and drawing their own very careful conclusions about American power, American will, and American vulnerability.